The day I realized my son had control over my $1 million, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't confront him. I simply went quiet in a way that only comes when something inside you locks into place forever. Because betrayal like this doesn't arrive violently. It slips in wearing concern, using gentle words like protection, safety, and I'm just trying to help you. Before I take you deeper into how the person I trusted most slowly positioned himself between me and my own money, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you at home, driving after a long day, or lying awake wondering how life shifted so quietly? Tell me in the comments. And if you appreciate realistic revenge stories, the kind built on patience, intelligence, and dignity, please like this video. It truly helps keep these stories alive. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 69 years old, born and raised in the United States, and until recently I believed I had done everything right. I worked for over 4 decades in corporate accounting, raised a family, buried my husband too early, and made sure I would never depend on anyone in my later years. When I sold our family property and walked away with just over $1 million, I felt secure. Not rich, not reckless, just safe. That money represented discipline, sacrifice, and survival. And I trusted my son, Daniel, because I raised him to be responsible. Or at least, I thought I did. What I didn't understand at the time was that trust, when mixed with entitlement, can quietly turn into something far more dangerous. Daniel had always known how to sound reasonable. Even as a boy, he could explain his way out of trouble with a calm voice and carefully chosen words. And as an adult, that skill had only sharpened. After the sale of the property, when the money settled into my account, he didn't rush me or demand anything outright. He waited. He asked questions instead. How often I checked my statements, whether managing large sums felt stressful, if I ever worried about scams or mistakes. He sent me articles about older Americans losing savings to fraud, stories framed as cautionary tales, but delivered with just enough emphasis to plant doubt. I listened because it sounded practical, not manipulative. He suggested that maybe, just temporarily, he could help oversee things. Not take control, he stressed, just add a layer of protection. "You've carried enough responsibility in your life, Mom," he said one evening over dinner, his tone gentle, almost proud. "Let me take some of that weight." I remember looking at him then, sitting across from me at my own table, and feeling a quiet relief. I thought this was what good parenting led to: children who stepped up, who wanted to help. So when he proposed moving the money into an account structure that required his involvement for verification purposes, I didn't see danger. I saw family. I saw continuity. I saw a son who knew the system better than I did, offering support. What I didn't see, what I couldn't yet see, was how easily help can become leverage when the person offering it believes they know what's best for your life more than you do. At first, nothing seemed different, and that was the most convincing part of all. The money was still there, the statements still arrived, and Daniel never raised his voice or overstepped in ways that were obvious enough to question. He framed every interaction as collaboration, not authority. If I mentioned a planned expense, he'd nod and say it sounded fine, sometimes even encouraging me to enjoy myself more. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. Instead of asking what I planned to do, he began asking why. Why that amount? Why that timing? Why I needed to travel so far? It wasn't confrontation. It was interrogation disguised as concern. I found myself explaining decisions I had never needed to justify before, and I did it without realizing how unnatural it was. When a small transfer took longer than expected, Daniel brushed it off as extra verification. When a payment required his approval, he laughed and said it was just a temporary setting the bank insisted on. Each delay came with reassurance, each restriction with logic, and because there was no single dramatic red flag, I accepted the pattern instead of challenging it. What I didn't understand yet was that control rarely announces itself. It tests boundaries quietly, watching how much resistance it meets. And every time I waited instead of questioning, every time I adjusted instead of objecting, I was teaching him something, that my comfort mattered less than his confidence, and that silence could be mistaken for consent. The moment the balance of power truly shifted wasn't loud or dramatic, it was administrative. I discovered it standing in line at my bank, holding a withdrawal slip for a modest amount I needed for a home repair. The teller typed, paused, and then looked up with an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told me the transaction required secondary authorization. I remember blinking, genuinely confused, asking her to repeat herself. Secondary authorization, from whom? She lowered her voice and said my son's name. Daniel. Just like that, a stranger said his name as if it were more relevant than mine. I felt a cold, hollow sensation move through my chest, not fear exactly, but disbelief. I'd spent my entire adult life handling accounts, audits, and budgets larger than this teller would ever see, and now I was being told, politely, professionally, that my own money was no longer entirely mine to move. I signed nothing new that day. I didn't argue. I thanked her, folded the slip, and walked back to my car with steady hands. But inside, something cracked open. Because for the first time, I understood that this wasn't about convenience or safety anymore. This was about access, authority, control that had been quietly transferred while I was busy trusting the wrong person. When I asked Daniel about it later that evening, I didn't accuse him. I didn't even raise my voice. I asked the way a mother asks a child she's already forgiven, calm, open, giving him every opportunity to explain. He didn't deny it. He sighed, sat back in his chair, and told me it was for my own good. He said the bank recommended it. He said large sums made him nervous on my behalf. He said he'd noticed I seemed less sharp lately. Small things like repeating stories or forgetting dates, details any human being forgets at any age. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if he were managing my emotions rather than answering my question. And that's when I realized something deeply unsettling. He had rehearsed this. Every word, every justification had been prepared long before I ever stood at that teller's counter. When I pushed back, gently, reasonably, he responded not with discussion but with reassurance, the kind you give someone you've already decided won't change your mind. "You don't need to worry about this stuff anymore, Mom," he said. "I've got it handled." That sentence lingered in the air long after he left, heavy with implication, because I wasn't asking him to handle my life. I was asking him to respect it. And in that moment, I finally understood that what he saw as responsibility, I was beginning to see as entitlement. From that point forward, I stopped pushing back, and that decision changed everything. Not because I gave up, but because I finally understood the nature of the game being played. Resistance, I realized, only strengthened Daniel's narrative. Every question I asked became evidence of my confusion. Every moment of frustration was quietly logged as emotional instability. So instead, I became agreeable. I thanked him for checking in. I asked for his opinion before making plans. I let him believe his authority was complete. And while he relaxed into that confidence, I began to observe. I paid attention to the language he used with bankers, the way he framed his involvement as necessity rather than choice. I noticed which institutions deferred to him automatically and which still deferred to me when I spoke clearly and directly. I listened more than I talked. I documented everything, dates, conversations, approvals, delays, without ever announcing what I was doing. Years of professional discipline returned to me like muscle memory. Daniel thought I was retreating, when in reality I was mapping the terrain. Because when control is built quietly, it can be dismantled the same way, patiently, precisely, and without warning. What Daniel never considered was that I had spent my entire career untangling systems that looked airtight from the outside. Corporate structures, financial oversight, internal controls, none of them collapse under force. They unravel under understanding. While he assumed I was settling into dependency, I was quietly reclaiming fluency. I scheduled appointments without telling him, choosing branches and offices he never visited. I asked questions framed as curiosity, not challenge. I learned exactly which permissions were revocable, which required formal notice, and which only existed because no one had ever questioned them. I contacted an independent financial advisor under the pretense of estate planning and spoke in hypotheticals until the truth was clear. The most important discovery was this. Daniel's control depended entirely on the assumption that I would not act alone. The moment I stepped outside the small circle he had built around me, his authority weakened. He didn't own the system. He was merely standing in a space no one expected me to enter. And once I saw that, the fear he relied on vanished. All that remained was timing. The final phase required patience, and patience has always been my quiet strength. I waited until everything was in place, until accounts were prepared, permissions clarified, and documentation complete. I waited until Daniel grew comfortable again, until he stopped watching so closely, until he assumed the balance had settled permanently in his favor. Then, on a Tuesday morning that looked ordinary in every way, I acted. Not with confrontation, not with warning, but with precision. I met privately with my advisor and executed the changes we had discussed weeks earlier. Authorizations were revoked. Access was restructured. The account was placed into a legal framework that returned full control to me and removed Daniel's involvement entirely, cleanly, lawfully, and without drama. By the time he noticed something was wrong, it was already finished. He called later that afternoon, his voice tight, confused, asking why a transfer hadn't gone through. I listened calmly, then told him the truth in the simplest terms possible. I had taken my money back. There was no argument left for him to make, no setting to adjust, no authority to reclaim. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. For the first time, he understood what I had known for weeks, that control only exists when both sides believe in it. Daniel came over that evening, unannounced, carrying the kind of restrained anger that tries very hard to look like concern. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He sat across from me at the same table where he had once spoken to me like a dependent and asked how I could do something like this without telling him. I let him finish before I answered. I told him I hadn't taken anything from him. I had simply reclaimed what was always mine. I reminded him, calmly and without bitterness, that help is offered, not imposed, and that love does not require control to survive. He tried to reframe it again, to talk about risk and responsibility, about how stressful it had been for him to manage my finances. That was the moment the last illusion fell away. I told him I didn't need a manager, a guardian, or a protector. I needed a son who respected my autonomy. And if he couldn't do that, then the distance between us was not punishment, it was a boundary. He left shortly after, quieter than he arrived, carrying the weight of a realization he hadn't prepared for. That entitlement, once exposed, has nowhere to hide. I didn't feel victorious watching him go. I felt settled, because the outcome wasn't about winning against him. It was about standing fully back inside my own life, unchallenged and whole. In the weeks that followed, life didn't explode into chaos the way people expect after something like this. It grew quieter, clearer. I slept better. I made decisions without rehearsing them in my head first. I noticed how much energy I had been spending trying to appear reasonable, grateful, manageable. Without that weight, everything felt lighter. Daniel and I spoke occasionally after that, carefully, respectfully, with a distance that felt honest instead of forced. I didn't chase reconciliation, and I didn't fear it either. Whatever relationship remained would exist on equal ground or not at all. And as I moved forward, I understood something I wish more people were taught earlier in life. Dignity doesn't need permission, and independence doesn't expire with age. The quiet revenge I carried out wasn't about teaching my son a lesson. It was about teaching myself one. That no matter how softly control arrives, it can be undone with clarity, patience, and the courage to stop shrinking. Because the moment you choose yourself without apology, the story changes, and it never goes back to the way it was before. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt controlled, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside by someone you trusted, know that you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. And if you value stories built on dignity, patience, and quiet justice, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub. These stories aren't about anger. They're about reclaiming your life and remembering your worth.